Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious philosophical pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, welcome once again to Syntax Error. I, as always, remain Scott Thurlow, and I'm here tonight with Jane Manzer.
Hello.
And Stephen Amosi.
And I am also here.
Indeed. And as we sometimes do, I've been finding, so disclaimer real quickly, we are not affiliated in any way, shape, or form with Gamasutra or anything else related to them. However, they seem to become one of the sites I visit more often because they have very good articles, links to other bloggers who are doing things that I like, things that are interesting to me within gaming. So in that vein, tonight's episode, we're going to discuss an article called Story, What is it Good For? By Thomas Grip. And real quickly, if you haven't heard of him, he is the, I believe, either lead writer or designer. He's very high up in directing the games at Frictional Games, the guys who did Soma and Amnesia and so forth. So this article is fairly recent. It's about, I think it's from back in just back in May. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty up to date. So it's basically framing the question of why video games have stories and how they can be used, or how they were used maybe in the past, and how they can be used better in the future to marry that, and of course, and gameplay, which is something we talk about a lot in general. This one is very specific and goes through a number of points. So we're going to discuss it itself, because I think it does make maybe two very interesting or valid points that still stand to this day, and a couple of things, like, again, things that we know, things that we've sort of already agreed upon in general.
Right.
But to start off with, he sort of goes, he mentions two other articles that brought up the same general topic recently as well, in which he agreed with the points, but not the conclusions of one. And we may link those. I'll link this one for sure. But I think the first quote I have is that it's sort of like when people say, oh, why don't you just go write a video, or why don't you go write a book or make a movie instead of putting your story into a game? There's sort of like a common, like, backhanded insult, if you will, like backhanded compliment, like, hey, if you just want to do a story, go do something, get out of this medium, because it's a lesser needed factor. Like, story takes a backseat really to gameplay. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think it should be. It can be, but I think it should be better married, and I think he's arguing for. What do you think?
Well, I think in order to really give my opinion of this, I need to jump ahead a tiny bit.
Okay, sure. To
where he's saying that, like, it's not the fact that narrative conflicts with gameplay. Narrative is an inescapable aspect of gameplay.
Exactly, I think it's a very good point to bring up.
And that,
right
we actually did a TED Talk about a topic he brought, or a video he brought up with, if you're given, like, just images like a triangle and a square.
Abstract shapes moving around.
You'll give it a plot line. And he's saying that, like, Asteroids, like, is a really good example of that, just abstract
shapes moving around,
and there needs to be a kind of, in order to grasp the abstract, you need to give a narrative, and you can't just leave it up to the user to grasp, to create their own narrative. You need to give them a sort of direction.
Exactly.
I think what's brilliant about that point, specifically regarding Asteroids, is what he talks about, in that he says the overall structure for the game is given in the art design.
Essentially, the art on
in the art
arcade,
design of the cabinet.
Yes, I was waiting for when you bring up
that comes with the game, and that's enough for Asteroids, because it's not a super deep game, and you can have a little bit of art design that comes with it, and then whoever is playing that game will understand what's going on. And I think that's kind of brilliant, and it got me off on my own tangent while I was reading this, of, like, thinking about how much do you need to grasp the concept of the game. And he talks about this a little bit later on when he talks about
exactly
more in-depth stories need more in-depth design that goes around, that complements
that
wraps around,
essentially.
That wraps around the story and wraps around the game. And I think that's kind of a genius point. It's very important that you have the minimum amount of context for a game. And I think another thing that's also important that he doesn't really bring up in this, but this is what this made me think about, is that you don't give too much context.
He does briefly mention that, and I agree with all of that, and that's why, like I said, this is I felt a good article to pick from, because it raises all those points, and a couple others that we just said, but I think they're all, it almost seems like obvious that like you should tailor your story to whatever the gameplay is going to be and have them like complement each other, but as is obvious as well, that isn't often the case. It's not always the case. You've definitely seen games that didn't do it, or didn't do it right, or tried to and did it, failed at executing something like that. So, given all that, I just want to read out one quote, the one that got me early on. He writes, "If you just take stories as we normally see them in film or in books and apply them outright to games, there will be a lot of friction," which I thought was sort of like a cheeky thing because it's maybe because it's coming to called frictional, but nevertheless, I think that's definitely true. You can definitely see that. And as you just said, I believe, Steve-O, that there's a minimum amount of context that needs to be there in order to like enhance or like give you some kind of a framework to work with. But then the more you introduce, then the more you have to balance it out, in a sense.
Yeah.
So, in a way, you said earlier that, and I don't know if you intended to say this, but you said there's they should try to achieve like the minimal amount of context.
Right.
I don't know. Again, the point of there's a necessity for a minimal amount versus to strive for the minimum amount. But
yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah.
There's two games I actually want to bring up at this point. I'm a big fan of puzzle games, and I played Talos Principle and Witness recently, as in the past several years, and
past year or two. Anyway,
Talos Principle gave a very strong narrative structure that kept me going through the puzzle game. Because again, I enjoy puzzles just for their own sake, but at a point,
but having a nice framework, an interesting and relevant one,
gives me something that I'm actually striving for something here.
Exactly.
Right? That there's more to unlock narrative-wise if I complete puzzles. Whereas The Witness, I feel, falls below the minimal amount of context needed for a game.
I think you said, I have not played either of these games, to be fair, but I did, I think, recommend Talos Principle on the reviews and so forth that I saw. And I think you said to us precast, it's almost as if The Witness is the reverse of that, in which you get less context the more puzzles you solve, or at least certainly not any more that fills it out in any meaningful
And this goes to a
way.
point he brought that I really liked, is that if you leave up the narrative up to the audience, and you have a below the threshold of necessary context, eventually they'll come to conflicts within what is in the game.
It'll be like
the narrative
lunar dissonance, pretty much.
And The Witness suffer. I imagine that there's a greater purpose behind everything in here,
but you have no idea what it is.
Every story I was developing would be contradicted by the next thing I found, and it got to the point where I no longer felt that there was a greater purpose to me playing this game.
Would you say that it ruined your immersion?
It's in the game? Because I was aware that I was constantly developing a new narrative for it, and when I'm aware of that fact, I'm no longer immersed in the work.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Real quickly, to that point, the next, helpfully, the next quote I have picked out is that the trick is when imparting narrative is to know which part to leave blank and which ones to fill in. So it seems as if that wasn't quite like they didn't fill in enough or left too much blank. Conversely,
yes,
it is. And Ian, you said that you weren't sure if I meant that specifically in terms of you need the minimum amount. But I did. Like, I think that you summed it up very well when you said that. And I think that there should be every developer should be looking at whether or not they have given enough information first. And then the second thing on their list should be whether or not they are giving too much information and impeding the gameplay. Because at the heart of every video game, right, it needs to be a game. And we were talking about this before, Cass, and I want to bring it up now. I know you guys don't feel this way, but to me, the Telltale games get in their own way as far as telling a story through gameplay, right?
Through this medium.
I like the stories that they have to tell. I think that they're very interesting, but I think and I know that one of his like, you know, pet peeves in this article is that like, oh well, maybe you should have just written a book. But in terms of those games, and I don't feel this way about like walking sims, let's say, which are another like very story heavy genre
for the most part, yeah.
But as far as Telltale games go, they don't. It's not that they don't grab me, because I enjoy the stories for the most part in those games. But
you're saying it might as well.
What happens?
Not a game.
What I feel is like I don't want to be playing this. I want to be reading it or watching it. I would rather not be playing this game. It doesn't feel like a game to me. I'd rather be playing this story, right? When I'm playing a game, I want gameplay elements to be at the forefront, and they're just not for Telltale games. And I don't think that anybody's going to argue with that.
Sure. Well,
one more quick thing.
Yep.
Like and I'm not saying that everybody's going to feel that way. I think that there is a lot to be said for games like that, and a lot of people really like them, but they're just not for me because of that reason. Because they're not games to me; they're more stories, right?
And I completely understand that. And not that I want to get into a discussion about Telltale games per se, but he does mention them. And like you're right, of course, there's going to be like a subjective fine line, and that means it's going to move. Like you can't say for sure, like. Where one player versus another is going to come down on that. I just think in general, his point, one of his points at least, is that, for example, going back to the Asteroids thing and tying them both together, Asteroids is a very simple game with a simple premise. Therefore, you only need a simple story context in order to framework it. As they get more complex, you're going to need more and more. The ratio will go up. But conversely, like as you just said, I don't think like necessarily like gameplay elements, mechanics have to take precedence over story. I think one done well, you can have them both equally effective.
Actually, there's a point he makes. I forget where he does it in the article.
I'm trying to find it.
I remember back in the day, actually, I would say it was the first time I really recognized the difference between gameplay and story. And it's Final Fantasy VII. When Aerith dies, spoiler alert, after 20 years. Or
statute of limitations has already been expired for 10 years.
I thought, like, look, I have, like, I watched characters get shot to death and fall over in battle, and I used the Phoenix down to resurrect them. I have 99 of them in my inventory. Yeah. I also have life materia. Why is she dead here when I've seen her die 100 other times and resurrected her?
Sure.
Yeah.
And but that's when
you notice the split.
Yeah, that there is, and I think he mentions that, not that line specifically, but a very similar type.
Right. He does bring that up.
Here's what I'll say in that specific context, and it's going to be context related. Every game's going to be different in terms of this, but in that specific context, it didn't bother me because of the way that Final Fantasy VII was set up to tell its story, right? I didn't take gameplay elements and cutscene elements to be on a 1-to-1 ratio, and perhaps I should have, and perhaps that is the goal, or perhaps that should be the goal of games. But at the time that came out, it was something so new and something so interesting to me that it didn't bother me at all when that happened.
Sure, you were.
But I get exactly what the article's saying. I get exactly what you're saying.
Like back in the PS2 era, PS1, where cutscenes were pretty heavy. Yeah. You'd have you'd have like an action adventure, like Max Payne or something like that. Those kind of games.
Yeah, or even Resident Evil or something like that. Anything.
Where all of a sudden a character who took a bunch of bullets is in a cutscene, and now he's susceptible to being hurt by a gunshot. And I can definitely see where but as I think he points out, that's poor narrative. That's not necessarily a problem with narrative in gameplay.
But I won't even say that. Like in those contexts, as long as it's done well, I can suspend my disbelief for that.
Right, to a certain degree. I think you're saying.
I go into that type of game willing to suspend my disbelief on something like that, and it's all a matter of whether it's done well, I think, and whether it's done like in a way that you honestly, for most of those games like Max Payne and stuff like that, it's gonna come down to, was that cool enough to like suspend your disbelief, or like, or is it not cool enough and you just be like, what the hell, like what's going on?
For sure.
Like, that's basically all it comes down to in terms of cutscenes, and it's sad to say, but like for those early PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 games, I think it came down to a lot of did they spend enough money on the cutscenes to make it believable enough to like allow you to suspend your disbelief?
Of course. I mean, I agree in that sort of interesting subdivision of this.
Right.
But I mean, you're definitely right to an extent, and I think he mentions, like, again, nebulously, something like that, where, yes, it's again, somewhat ludonarrative distance, even before that term was even invented,
Right.
because it was an earlier, like, the medium was still, like, evolving at that point, and still is to this day, don't get me wrong, but at that point, like, the Aerith thing is a turning point in narrative, in melding narrative and gameplay. So yes, while you're like, oh, I have 1,000 Phoenix Downs, why can't I just use them? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was their attempt to push it forward to some extent.
And the other thing with that is, like, that created a whole new outlook on games.
Exactly.
When that happened.
Exactly.
Like,
it changed the medium.
You can look back
in
at
a way.
games that were around that era, and they were doing all kinds of different things around then. They were trying all kinds of different things.
And some of them worked, and some of them did not.
Metal Gear Solid came out around the same time.
Yeah.
Like Ape Escape came out around the same time, and like as much as like a lot of people don't remember Ape Escape, probably, but like
I remember of it.
This game completely changed how you use joysticks on your controller, and like it was the first game to actually take full advantage of the sticks, and like so that plays into how your narrative works, how your story works.
Of course,
absolutely. And all that type of stuff. And like many games after that used this, this where they came from on that in order to work stuff into narrative to good effect or to bad effect,
Sure, agreed. And like that actually brings me to the next quote I had picked out real quickly, is that to sort of encapsulate a lot of things we just said, is that story is not something to just be slapped onto a game, because, going back to his original like reference, that game designers secretly want to be film directors or authors instead. It's that they're there because they're crucial to the end experience, right? So yes, there are games in which there's like Tetris example. There is zero story to Tetris because it doesn't need it, but because they're very straightforward and possible to grasp, like easy to grasp.
But I will say, Ian, do you have something to say? You want to jump in?
I was just going to make reference to it. Actually, Tetris actually has a deep story with the Russians. And
yes, that's exactly what I was going to say.
You like to think that, but really, it's. I mean, it's not that.
But here's the thing, like
but I guess you could part that story onto a non-story game.
Of the
having the
wall.
having the what the hell are they called? The buildings with the little mushroom caps on them. I forget what
the domes on them.
Yeah. But like those clearly like Russian architecture, having that in there,
the Kremlin.
While you don't actually have a story per se in Tetris, you have something to like grab onto. You have like
you have a quick visual image that's
a very bare narrative to grab onto.
Sure, I suppose. It's almost like the thing like Papers, Please might be a kind of a good modern-ish example in which, not quite, but like it has a story, but the gameplay is very simple. Are you going to prove this person or not? But like you impart like narrative stakes sort of like upon that because of the framework. So anyway, actually speaking in that vein, and going back to sort of the walking sim thing you just mentioned a couple minutes ago, is that the next one he brings up, which is a game I thought was very well done and sort of agree with, and everyone should check it out, read my article. It's What Remains of Edith Finch, in which, again, it's a walking sim at the end of the day, but because it's cut up into story vignettes, a story relative to each character that's introduced, the gameplay is sort of like framed and based around that character in a sense. It's not complicated gameplay, to be sure, but each vignette you come across has a different sort of little mechanic that's thrown into it that makes it interesting and ties the whole narrative together. It really ties the narrative together, if you will. But
I will.
And the thing is, like, he points to it, and like I said, I agree that sort of like that's kind of the next evolution, like another step we can take to melding these two aspects together to make a very good game experience, which covers both areas.
Versus the game I got by accident instead of Dear Esther, which is you just walking around and listening to someone narrate to you.
Yeah.
So it's...
Exactly. So, like, you know, I'm saying all his point is, like, yes...
Versus Ether 1.
Like, yeah, well, Ether 1 was okay, too, and we talked about
That's
that
all
earlier.
VR shit.
Sort of. But all I'm saying is, like, the general point of the article, or like, at least one of the major points that sort of, like, its tendrils are in the other points, is that if you want to have an interesting and engaging story melded with gameplay, you need to consider both ends of it. And this is something we've said before, previous to Syntax. I just think, like, more developers, maybe more audiences should be aware of, like, how it's used and it's able to be used, and how sometimes you can see where it could have been used better, or where it could have been sort of toned back to make a better experience.
So if games are a conflict between narrative and gameplay, I think one of the things...
I don't think they're a conflict, though.
I think that a lot of conflict does rise from them.
Sure.
I think what the point he's trying to make in this article is that narrative should arise naturally from gameplay versus trying to structure
artificially
either gameplay
throw
around
something on there,
narrative or just try to stick something on there. So I think that's basically what his whole thesis is.
I pretty much agree. I agree, and I agree with it. And that leads me to the last quote I have picked out here, is that he writes, "Games are not trying to tell deeper stories," in quotes, compared to films or novels or any other medium. They are trying to provide deeper thematic play. And a core part in achieving this is by putting more focus on story content, which is a very different goal from that other media. And so to say you might as well write a book is to gravely misunderstand the challenge at hand in games. I think that's sort of like a very nice concluding statement that encapsulates what we just said.
I completely agree with that.
Right? I think that you can't, because it makes perfect sense.
I think that since their ascension, games have gotten kind of a bad rap. Video games.
Well, sometimes
video games have gotten kind of a bad rap, especially in like academic circles, right? And they're starting to move away from that now, and there's more.
Well, I'm personally working towards changing.
There's
that,
more
obviously.
academic
coverage
material
of it,
about gameplay now, about video games and stuff like that now. But there's something to be said for the way that games work over all other media, and I think that's kind of what I think it's kind of what he's trying to say. Is like he's trying to assert that, look, this is a different medium,
and thus you have to use them differently.
It's going to be used differently.
Exactly,
and that's where that's where its value is going to come from. And I think that, to me, so this is where I'm going to insert my own thing in here.
Sure,
but to me, that's where the Telltale games fail, to me, because I think they're trying to be more of a story
on that scale
rather than a game. And I think that games are a completely separate thing.
I'm going to go to the argument against the academic. The thing is, I think that there is a couple of developers are attempting to create art through video games, and not just through the gameplay aspect, but narrative-wise. I remember when Grand Theft Auto 4 came out, a lot of people were saying that that was the best movie of the year.
I still think it's still a great game, and because of that, I agree. Go on.
If you look at the Nathan Drake series,
Uncharted,
which I can never remember on the show. Anyway, that tries to be the summer blockbuster.
Sure.
And it has elements to it, but I think that, or you look at the God of War series, which has a decent narrative, but it's still like core set in it's like an action
gameplay.
movie.
Yeah.
And the thing is, look at what critics actually like in film and novels. They're very deep works. And I don't know if that one video game came out yet that is considered the great profound artistic piece.
Yeah, Bioshock, of course. But I'm always going to say that, and you knew I was going to say it.
Yeah, but
I mean, great.
But here's the thing: I think that there's games like that coming out all the time. There's Journey, which was this like very, and there's what was it called, Flower, which I haven't played. About. But like, there's games that are trying to be works of art, The problem is that they haven't hit the mainstream
If
yet.
you want to think,
Perhaps
it's at the short story.
Other than
It's
Bioshock.
at the like short film level. When you come with the great things, there's that not that great like epic.
I see what you're
sweeping
saying.
Masterpiece.
Yeah. No, I get it.
And I think once that comes out, then I'm not talking. I think that there's arguments to be made,
But-
but amongst fans. But for the critics to actually appreciate this as a narrative masterpiece,
As a
like,
respectable...
that one game has to come out, and I think it's approaching, but it hasn't reached.
Sure,
it yet.
and that's sort of I'm saying like kind of my closing thoughts is that the art like Thomas Grip in this article points out like yes, we're working towards that, and here's maybe some ways, here are some things you have to consider versus the other mediums, and here's possibilities that we can in which to have a chance to use them in such a way in order to create the great epic game story that you're sort of mentioning.
And kind of what I'll say is that who is really to say what is art or not? Like, right? Like, are you
Sure,
saying?
like we've already had this argument.
Yeah,
on
Ian's
various-
the arbiter of art.
on various things.
But aside from that, if you call film art, if you just call film an art, right? How can you say that video games are not an art?
Well, I've never said that.
And I know you haven't, but people have.
Some do. Yes.
And very like Siskel and Ebert said that.
Yes, I
right?
know.
Like,
I know you're going to bring that up,
and
but
and
again,
it's just a ridiculous point to
of
me, right?
course I agree.
Like,
but
it's
calm
the,
down.
It's the same thing. Like, this is a new medium, sure, but how can you say that it is not art?
They don't
If
contain-
it- like,
They don't contain artistic
I mean,
elements.
if
No,
you
of
if you
course.
if you can say that film is art, then you can surely say that video games are art.
Yes,
If you can say that if your contention is that some films are not art and some films are art, then that has to be your same contention for video games.
I'm saying that for an academic, you need that one piece.
the killer app in
it's not that
academia
I
hasn't
disagree
come out
with
yet.
you.
Is what he's
It's that
saying.
I feel that it still hasn't achieved. It needs that
Yeah.
one thing to achieve that level of
Yeah,
respect. I
there's
don't
no
know what it
consensus, I believe, is what you're saying. Yeah, here
is.
for that like one factor.
Perhaps there hasn't been that great work yet, right? Even though I know Scott will always make his case for BioShock, and
As of now,
I don't necessarily disagree with that. But that's you can't. I don't know. It seems like the epitome of stupidity to me
great phrase.
to say that like there is the perfect, you know, like Citizen Kane is the perfect film, but there can never be a perfect video game in terms of art. Like that just seems idiotic to me.
No statement of never.
Yeah.
Unless I'm
Exactly. Well,
But there are
We're not-
people that say that video games
Right.
can't be art,
and which
and that's crazy. to
perhaps
me,
would convince them on this episode. Perhaps
Right?
not.
We're on a whole
But, yeah.
other tangent from the.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm sorry. I
No, it's
apologize.
okay. Like the thing is, like yes, you can get from this article to there
Yeah.
because of that. But the thing is, like as we mentioned and as we always agreed that we already like say that there are like there's no argument, there's no question about it in our minds at least. So given that, moving on from that is that how then best to use these elements within this medium in order to create a more complex and deeper, if not deeper, like just better melded, again, marriage of the story, the narrative elements, i.e. story itself, and have also be interesting gameplay. The mechanics also blend together to create that perfect, again, that the Citizen Kane of game, whatever it may be.
a VR version of Citizen Kane.
Yeah. If developers are out there, try it, I guess. Get the rights to Citizen Kane and make it. But, I mean, that's really funny suggestion. I like it. We always come up with quality stuff here at the somehow.
Yeah.
But no, all I'm saying is like the last little quote that I just read, I think sort of stands as the general point, and I think it's beneficial to, get that out to like try to get that across to developers, fans, anyone who's interested in this medium and gaming as a hobby, to see where we can take it, to see what can be done with what has come before and how to advance it in order to come to a point in which the quality itself, like overall in the industry, perhaps gets better. So we're producing more quality games that do have the minimum context and perhaps the best context for the game they're trying to make.
So my final thought on this is that if you actually are a fan of narrative, the melding of narrative and gameplay, this is a really good article to read.
It's a good kind of
highlights
starter,
a lot of the challenges and also kind of counterexamples to common criticism against narrative and gameplay. Mm-hmm. And I fully recommend. I thought it was a great read.
Yeah,
one for recommend. I agree.
Agreed. So yeah, check it out. So I believe any other final thoughts? I think that'll do it.
I'm all set, yeah.
So again, this has been Syntax Error talking about Story. What is it good for? By Thomas Grip. And I've been Scott Thurlow, of course, as always, here with Jane Manzer.
Absolutely nothing.
And Stephen Amosi.
My God.
And we will see you next time. Good night.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow. Music by Stephen Hermosi. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.